So I want to get a few ground rules off the table before we start. Number one, your favorite band will not be mentioned. Unless your favorite band is a pop punk band, at which point it probably will be mentioned because the 2000s were weird. But I apologize in advance if I do not list your favorite band from like the 80s hardcore underground. My girlfriend and I, when we were working on this, she was throwing names at me and I said, if I just do what you're telling me to do, I'm going to have a 45-minute panel just talking about proto-punk in the 70s. And I do not have time for that. So no, I apologize. Your favorite band will probably not be mentioned, but if you have a rec for me, give it to me at the end of the panel. I plan to give this again, and I thoroughly love getting new music. This panel was written specifically for people who either really like punk rock and just want to sit and watch some music videos and have fun, people who know nothing about punk rock, who want to get some names and kind of get a foothold into the genre, people who want to feel smug and superior about themselves because they know more than I do. And to give you an idea, I'm a 20-year scene veteran. I got in 1998 in the New York scene through The Offspring. And I kind of just went from there, tangential to the metal scene at the same time, back in The Offspring at places like Castle Heights. I used to love that stuff. And I worked for 2 radio promoters, 2 college radio stations, and 3 record labels. So I spent the entirety of my 20s pretty much absorbing the scene in New York and thoroughly enjoying it. And I like to relay things to people. So also of note, I have some references for people who are looking for references and references in a punk panel. There's plenty of good books out there. In fact, in September, journalist Ian Winwood put out the book Smash about 1994. So it's about NoFX, Bad Religion, Green Day, and The Offspring. And it is an amazing book. It is culled from interviews he's done with all the bands, and it talks about that particular era because the 70s have been covered to death. The 80s, like Our Band Can Be Your Life by Michael Azerrad, is the definitive 80s punk book. You can't find better than that. The 80s has been done to death. The 70s has been done to death. Hardcore has been done to death. They just released a new update to the New York Hardcore documentary. And I'm going to see it. I'm going to go see it in February. They're showing it at my local art house cinema. And that's been documented. Smash is for people who want to talk about 90s pop punk, 90s punk when it really started to go mainstream. Good book about it. Of course, Please Kill Me is the going rate for books about the punk scene. Read it, then read it, piss on it, give it to your friend. That's all you have to do with that book. Now, this was the fun one. Martin Popoff's Punk Tees. I saw this at Barnes & Noble 2 years ago. And I bought it for like $10. And it's one of those books that they just sell that's like, oh, take a look at this weird little coffee table book. No. Martin Popoff did interviews with people that grew up in the 70s and 80s all over the world. And he uses t-shirts as a way of showing the evolution of the punk genre. In fact, he actually gave a really great quote where he said, the Ramones made more money off of their t-shirt than off of CDs. And I can believe this because everyone I know has a Ramones t-shirt or 2, but I only know 4 people who actually own Ramones albums, counting myself and my girlfriend, which is really sad. Now, no, the crown jewel is the one I don't wear anymore. I have one that has Marky on it. And I am afraid to wear that out of the house because that's going to fall apart one day. And I went online looking for a Marky Ramone t-shirt, $400. Vintage only. This is my 3rd Ramone shirt. I bought this at Hot Topic. I got it for free. I picked up 2 Steven Universe shirts and got this for free. So that just goes to show you. Now, Dance of Days, excellent look at hardcore and punk in the nation's capital. So good for this region and what this region has done for the music scene. What it's done for things like hardcore, what it's done for things like it's the hardcore section. I'll talk about it. But really great book. Really great to look at. And of course, I said Our Band Can Be Your Life. And if you're one of these people who doesn't want to mock emo, I also would add Andy Greenwald's Nothing Feels Good, which is a chronicle of 96 to 2002, the growth of post-hardcore and emo. He talks about Dashboard Confessional, Further Seems Forever, Taking Back Sunday. In fact, it's really funny. The Taking Back Sunday show that he talks about going to at the Knitting Factory where the fan failed and everyone was passing up from heat exhaustion, I was there, pressed up against the glass door. And the moment the concert ended, that door opened and I fell flat on my ass. But it doesn't matter because why not? Also, fun little bit of cred fact that I have. Back when I was in undergrad, Blake Schwarzenbach was my English professor. So let's just run down that line. That's something to bring in here. So there's a lot that can go into this when you talk about punk, because the most punk thing in the world is to not give a flying about punk. Because ultimately, this is a genre and this is a lifestyle about disaffection. And when you listen to a lot of the original bands, get involved in the original core of the music scene, it was disaffected musicians playing disaffected music. Has anyone here ever seen the amazing documentary End of the Century? It's about the Ramones. In this documentary, the Ramones flat out said, we wanted to be the Beach Boys, but we suck. So we just played as loud and fast as possible, and turns out we were onto something. And that's kind of the deal behind it. A lot of this was built out of disaffection, wanting to be one thing but not getting it, running down the line with it. At the same time, there's a lot of DIY. Do it yourself is like the crux of the scene. If it doesn't exist, do it. If it doesn't exist, make it happen. If it doesn't exist, well, that's your own damn problem. For the last 10 years or so of me doing stuff at anime conventions, I actually have applied the DIY content to how I do panels, because if I don't see it, I do it. And if you disagree with me, well, then you get up here and do it. Because ultimately, that's how you grow and that's how you talk about things. Now, my favorite one actually, wait, look at this, also is a quote from the lead singer of the New York Dolls, "Fake it till you make it." And the New York Dolls were very famous about saying, we don't know what the hell we're doing, so we're just playing the best we can play at the best speed we can play until it happens. And that's kind of important to look at as well. Now, I like this other one, fashion through anti-fashion. Now, while proto-punk might have been a musical style, and hardcore definitely was a musical style, original punk you cannot separate from the trappings of fashion. Malcolm McLaren, who created the Sex Pistols, prefab, who created the Sex Pistols, owned a sex shop. And one of the biggest rumors going around is that he created the Sex Pistols specifically to model clothes from his store. And when you look at the scene, you see a lot of fashion throwing in here. Ultimately, it also comes down to that horrible term, credibility. And this is something that if you ever grew up in a scene between the 80s and 90s, you would get the credibility discussion thrown around. These people are in punk. They like Fall Out Boy. Are you familiar with Fall Out Boy's legacy in Chicago hardcore? What? Exactly. But you also have this idea of, especially as the genre began to evolve, people who would be playing punk rock. The greatest example of this is The Offspring. Best example of credibility discussion I can think of is The Offspring. The Offspring started in the 80s. They grew up inspired by Social Distortion. They grew up in the punk scene. They were very interested in working in the punk scene, but because they didn't participate as much as other bands, they were always seen as outsiders. They didn't have enough cred. Then compare that to a band like Green Day. Was a big part of the scene, played very pop-heavy music, but because it was pop-heavy, they got blacklisted from their own punk club. And a lot of these cred discussions were about maintaining a form of purism. I am not a purist. In any sense of the word, I am not a punk purist. I like the music, I like the culture, I like the community. I like coming together and building that community. I like going to shows. I like jumping up and down and punching people in the face. I've gone to many agnostic front shows, and I have scars in certain parts of my body from those same agnostic front shows. But at the same time, the fact that I have to say I've gone to agnostic front shows shows that cred is still something in my mind. I still think about having these notions of credibility. These have all been part of the scene for a good chunk of the scene's inception. And when you look at it, I love this quote. This is from the Punk Tees. Punk was and remains a defiant lifestyle choice wrapped in an aesthetically brave sense of fashion that was and is multidimensional visual assault. Early punk was all about in your face. The music was terrible, but it got you to listen. They were snotty, but it got you to pay attention. And as the 70s kicked over into the 80s, that was the uniform. I will talk at one point here about punk attitude versus punk music, but you start to see this defiance. And the defiance was its hallmark, its defining trait. At the same time, you have irony, not taking things too seriously, being anti-pretentious about music, which is why I find credibility discussions to be hilarious. You guys ever watch South Park? Do you remember the episode where they got the goth kid to join their little dance troupe? Because he's like, I'm so nonconformist, I'm not conforming with you and joining their dance troupe. That literally is this brought to life. The idea that it's supposed to be anti-pretentious about music that ultimately became the most pretentious genre for about good 10 years. And I love how it's also been compared to comic books. The musical equivalent of a comic book. Because comic books are over the top, comic books are flashy, comic books are underground yet mainstream, comic books and zines would occupy the same shelves of the stores, and they grew out of their own essence. And finally, thrown around at the same time, when you ask where punk got started, Rob isn't here. My friend Rob Aldrich, he was saying about how people have compared La Bamba to punk. I have heard it thrown around with Elvis Presley because he shook his hips too damn much. I've heard it get thrown around with Alice Cooper because that man did not give a flying F about anything he was doing. I've heard it applied to all these musicians that paved their own ways, bucked their own trends, and built up their own ideas. So I want to start by talking about proto-punk. Because if we want to have fun with this, we got to look before. And proto-punk for me goes all the way back to the 60s. And proto-punk is literally, I listed as anything pre-1975, with the sole exception of the band on my shirt. They were 74. I'll let them slide on that one. Anything pre-75 that embodies this ethos, it has this music, this attitude, and this dissonance, I label as proto-punk. This is when bands were becoming more experimental. You started seeing more power chords being used. Instead of it being the kind of thing you would dance to on like American Bandstand that my mom used to do, this was stuff that would never be seen in top 40, but managed to still crack the charts. It's identified by its roughness, its grotesque lyrics, and its theatrics. This is the era of David Bowie, gender bending himself with a really simple guitar in the background. This is the era of Richard Hell, dressing up in this weird little outfit but playing accessible pop style music. And a lot of this is popped between three major scenes, New York, Detroit, and London. London will give up its thing by the end of the 70s, and they'll never let us forget about it. I have been to London many times, and you would love to hear the Londoners think about American punk. They think it's terrible. But at the same time, these were the scenes where it popped up on both sides of the Atlantic and in the Detroit area. So I got a video for you I have to show you. I gave this panel earlier, like late last year, I keep forgetting it's 2019, at DerbyCon. And sitting right where you two are sitting is my friend Chelsea. And Chelsea is a transgender punk from the 60s, from the original glam era. And she has me look up a video and says, show this to the room. This is from 1964. And it goes to show you that even back in the 60s, you're starting to see the fashion and the dissonance.
There's a man walks the streets of London late at night.
Now, the two guys that you had for a second right at the beginning, they would go on to be part of Yes. Now, the music doesn't sound very punk to you. It sounds very 50s, very 60s. You look sexy, honey. But look at him. Look at this. This is Screaming Lord Sutch, actual English Lord. Actual English Lord. He starts horror pop. He sings about Dracula's daughter, Jack the Ripper. He has an album called Murder in the Graveyard that came out in 1992. People who played for him would play for The Who, would play for Yes, would play for all of these bands in the 70s and 80s. And in 1992, he reunited a bunch of them and recorded a live album, Murder in the Graveyard. He is an unsung hero of this era because he blended all of it together and inspired an entire generation after him. I love this. This is amazing. But this is 1964. You're already seeing the influences in the 60s. Let's be dissonant. Let's be crazy. Let's have some fun. And this is undoubtedly fun. So let me give you a few names from this era. So if you guys are looking for a playlist or looking for stuff to look into from the proto-punk era, there's a lot of really good names that pop up here. Now for me, probably the one that I would always cite in the first couple times of this panel, I would bring this one up, The Who. Most people would consider them to be the founder of the mod movement in the 80s, but The Who were one of the first bands to do power chords. They were one of the first bands to play as fast as humanly possible, and they were one of the first bands to not give a flying rat's ass about anything. And The Who laid the groundwork for a lot of the bands that would come later. In fact, one of my friends would go on loves to talk about pretty much all modern music can be traced back to either The Who or Led Zeppelin, because you're either doing power chords or you're playing fast and technical. And The Who at times would cross over this. Now, out of New York, you have the Velvet Underground, taking the fashion, taking the glam. Glam was a huge part of the scene at this point. Glam would give us things like the New York Dolls later down the line, blending together gender bending and the kind of things that would make you stop and stare and completely change how you would think of things. So I have to put this one on here. This is a band called Hawkwind. They're out of England. And Hawkwind was a bluesy style rock group from the 60s who one day put out a song that was really loud and really fast, and then they fired their bass player and would go on to release a bunch of rock operas. their bass player decided, the hell with you guys. I'm going to form my own band, and I'm going to name it after that song you hate. He called it Motorhead. And his name was Lemmy. And Motorhead, as you know, transcended genres. Rest in peace, Lemmy. You will be missed. And not just because you're not here to write songs for Triple H anymore. Now, you have in England, you have bands like the Sonics popping up. But if you want to talk about what, okay, confession. This next band I'm about to show, I had not heard them at all prior to working on this panel. I know Iggy Pop. I know Iggy Pop because of Henry Rollins, actually. But I had never listened to the Stooges prior to working on this panel. And I went out and bought a copy of Raw Power. Search and Destroy. Holy shit. Iggy influenced people like Henry Rollins, who spent his entire life trying to out Iggy and failing. Iggy influenced the punk movement by blending together bombast and insanity. And he would go on to influence an entire generation that shows you can play raw, you can play loud. Now, what I love about the album Raw Power, the original mix was by none other than David Bowie. And apparently, I've heard some of the tracks. It's so loud that it will destroy your hearing. Now, you have the New York Dolls bringing the glam into the movement, and their debut album was one of the highest selling debut albums of any band ever. It's an amazing album if you want to give it a hit. Richard Hell he could have been in the next section. Richard Hell, when he was in television, created songs like Blank Generation. He dressed the part. He had the ripped clothes, the safety pins. He did the eyeliner. He had the snotty attitude. He was the one that Malcolm McLaren was staring at from the other side of the pond and saying, I want my band to look like that. Yo, John Lydon, can you mimic that? Try. Richard Hell would go on to influence the fashion more than anything else, and it led to a lot of people saying that you cannot talk about the invention of punk without talking about him. And, of course, the hardest band in the world at the time, MC5. I would highly recommend just listening to Kick Out the Jams, not the Rage Against the Machine version, though I do like it, to listen to how much raw intensity and power there was. And just to give you a good idea of what I'm talking about with crossover, here's another quick video. What I love about this video is people try to put us to you see them dancing to it. Despite the fact that it's loud and powerful, you can still dance to it and enjoy it. As far as I'm concerned, this is punk right here. I could go into a pit and punch someone in the face. I won't, because I'm old, but I could. There's my playlist for this era. These are just some good songs. I'm highly going to recommend looking up Search and Destroy. It was hard picking New York Dolls. I went with Trash. And of course, Suffragette City. Another great song from like the proto artists that would go on to influence what came later. This will be the playlist that I recommend for this. But that's proto-punk. You have the early days of the discordant lyrics and the grotesquerie would give rise to the 70s, where the mantra became young, loud, and snotty. Punk was best described as anti-music. And at this point, half the bands were either failed pop groups that decided to get big by showing how much they suck, or they were bands that were trying to be as in your face as possible. Rather than, and I always thought this was funny. Probably when you talk about the standard bearers for this generation, especially if you're British, you talk about the Sex Pistols. And how the Sex Pistols were young, loud, and snotty and in your face. And that's actually where I got the line 3 chords in the truth. That was a Johnny Rotten quote. And yet they were signed to one of the largest record labels in the world. They wrote a trashy song about it, but they were still signed to one of the largest record labels in the world. At this point, you start seeing rock music and they're making it into a cartoon. It's music characterized by people who are unable to play music. So they create an ethos, they create an idea, and they run with it. And a lot of that could best be described with, this is from the movie Blank Generation. And this is where I have Richard Hell crossing over. Because a lot of punk bands in the late 70s cited Blank Generation as one of the songs that got them interested in playing this kind of music. But look at Richard over there in his black t-shirt. Listen to him try to sing. Look at the seedy club atmosphere they cultivated in this video.
camel in the bed. It's fascinating to observe what the male does, but when I dive into the wall, I separate. I belong to the blank generation. I belong to the generation.
Just pick down a television and join the Androids or like maybe 800 other bands that you know was put up. Just really attitude. There's a really good retrospective that came out about 3 weeks ago. It's a massive 20-track compilation as well. I recommend you grab it because it covers all of these all of these the pieces kind of raw, it's kind of loud, it's not very melodic. So, some names, because I'm going to give you some names. Got to give you some names talking about this era. And I have my line in the sand. When it comes to where does punk come from, where it comes to where did the line between proto-punk, like the Stooges, and punk rock start, I'm wearing them. And I've gotten into fistfights over the Ramones. Several reasons. One, I'm from Queens. We look out for each other. They're from Forest Hills. I live on the other side of the highway in Flushing. So we stick together, us Queens boys. The other thing is, and I love this, there's a really great interview that Joey Ramone did on Conan O'Brien in like 98, 99, where Conan O'Brien sits down and says, so yeah, you've been doing this forever. You've been doing this since like 76, 77. And he actually stops him and says, 74. And then Conan says, well, yeah, but you were doing the same thing with the Sex Pistols and the Clash. And he flat out says, we've been doing it longer. And he was clear that if anyone was going to take credit for this musical revolution, it was going to be Joey Ramone, which I find, again, really fun because if you watch End of the Century, there's a moment in End of the Century where he's in London for a big show. Like the Ramones would crisscross the country and create punk scenes wherever they went. It would last about 4 weeks. Everyone would get drunk, pass out, and it's over. He goes over to England and starts the same thing over in England. And he remembers he was at a club one day playing this big show, and someone throws a beer bottle at the window of the dressing room. And he opens up the window, and standing outside are the Clash and the Sex Pistols, and they want to come up. So they throw a sheet down so these guys can climb the side of the venue into the room, and they can sit in there and they can have some fun alongside the Ramones. And the Sex Pistols like to make fun of them and pull pranks on them, and the Clash like to pick their brains. But if you're going to see where this starts, you've got to start with the Ramones. Loud, fast, snotty music by musicians who didn't know what the hell they were doing and somehow faked it till they made it. That's where it starts. You go to Great Britain, you have bands like the Sex Pistols that were made to be a fashion statement. They were put together by a music manager who wanted to show snottiness and also show off the clothes he could sell. At the same time, you had the Clash, where it became political. If there's one thing about the Ramones, they didn't start getting political until the KKK took my baby away, which ironically is about Johnny Ramone stealing Joey Ramone's girlfriend. I wonder how Johnny felt playing that. But the Clash started to read. Like originally the Clash were, Joe Strummer was in a pub band called the 101ers. If you want to really take a look at the origins of punk, I recommend you look up pub rock because there's 2 names that are going to pop out. The 101ers who played these little happy songs about falling in love. And then there was this band who used to like throw blood on their audience and set fire to condoms and spit on the crowd in the pub scene in the 50s. And they would go on to become the Beatles. But that's a whole other story for a whole other day. The Clash started out as a couple of guys that were in a pub rock group that came together, and their manager would throw books at them and tell them to read. And they got very into the reading and the knowledge, and they started to put that into their story. Their breakout single, White Riot, was a riot that Joe Strummer attended. Career Opportunities talks about how you're never going to find a job in England. Safe European Home shows that there is no such thing as a safe European home. And whereas other bands were screaming and making asses of themselves to sell records, the Clash were busy experimenting, which I always thought it was funny. The single greatest record of the 1980s was released in 1979, and it's called London Calling. Meanwhile, out of Great Britain, you also have The Damned. And Ian Winwood, when talking about The Damned, says, The Damned did more for the American punk rock scene than any other band. Now, again, I take umbrage with that. But the other thing is, Ian Winwood is also British, and The Damned were local heroes. They would go out there and they'd throw down and they'd create their scene and they blended together all of the other bands. They had the musical wherewithal of the Ramones. They had the snottiness of the Sex Pistols. They had the personal awareness of the Clash, and they managed to carve out a very successful career. Check out Damned, Damned, Damned if you want to hear a good record that would later go on to inspire bands like the Misfits. You have the Vibrators with their provocative name, but they're not so provocative music. You have the Buzzcocks. This is where pop punk comes from. So people who say pop punk is just like a poppy offshoot from the 90s, no. The Buzzcocks were a pop band with a punk ethos, and they were doing this the same year as the Pistols, taking the idea and running with it. The Dead Boys were just freaking insane, and they all self-destructed. And finally, we have your punk band's favorite punk band, Devo. And people are like, Devo's not a punk band. Really? Really? They were dissonant. They were crazy. They were experimental. Every punk band you know loves Devo. You know who else loves Devo? My mom. You know why she loves Devo? She thought they were ill Devo. And she watched a concert and she's like, I like their hats. And my mom, who was from the 50s, likes Devo. Because Devo was just, this is where you're starting to see music and attitude becoming a big freaking deal. Devo's music might not be very punk, but my God, was their attitude punk. So I just want to give you another little video clip because I said I was playing music videos, and this is my favorite song by the Damned.
Is she really going out with him?
Really heavy bass line that's just as fast as the riff. We got the muffled, distorted guitars. This is the kind of stuff that I like.
I got a feeling inside of me. It's kind of strange, like a stormy sea. I don't know why, I don't know why. I guess these things have gotta be. I've got a new rose, I've got a good. Yes, I knew that I always would. I can't stop to mess around. I got a brand new rose in town. See the sun it shines. Don't get too close or it'll burn your eyes. Don't you run away that way. You can come back another day. I got a new rose, I got a good. Yes, I knew that I always would. I can't stop to mess around. I got a brand new rose in town.
Now, my girlfriend would kill me if I didn't put the events.
I never thought this could happen to me. Oh, this is strange. Oh, why should it be? I don't deserve somebody this great. I better go, or it'll be too late.
So, okay, just to clarify, I talked about how my girlfriend helped me on this. My girlfriend is an 80s punk, despite the fact that she was born in 1984. She's a super 80s punk, and today's her birthday. So I proceeded to buy her a bunch of stuff for that. But she punched me until I put Blondie on there, which is, it's weird because you don't think Blondie half the time, especially if you know them from their 90s revival, or you know them from Heart of Glass. But Blondie was part of this exact same scene, pushing the envelope. And I gotta brag again. So back in June, I'm at a con in Grand Rapids, this anime con in Grand Rapids, and I'm waiting for the elevator, and there's this woman by the elevator talking to some people, and I'm looking over, I'm like, she looks really familiar. We get onto the elevator, and it's just me and her, and we're going up, and I looked at her, and I'm like, look, I'm sorry about this, but are you Debbie Harry? And she's like, yes, I am. I'm like, holy shit, I love Blondie. And she didn't know what anime was. And I spent 10 minutes explaining to her what anime was, because she thought the costumes at JFAX were awesome. But Debbie Harry was staying at the exact same hotel that the con was at. Not the first time I met rock stars at a con, that would be Lynyrd Skynyrd, but that's the first time I met rock stars I respected at a con. So I needed to put this one other video on here simply because I like this video.
Little girls should be seen and not heard. Oh, Blondie! Oh,
This is X-ray specs. Female-fronted punk band. This was not commonplace, especially. Is that a strong zero? Okay. Cool. Yeah, I got it. So, this was not a thing you saw in the English scene very often. And there are people that will say this is not a punk band because they have saxophone. But the song is called Oh Bondage Up Yours, about the man keeping a girl down. So you can take from that what you will. I discovered these guys, ironically, through a movie. Excellent, excellent. Which one? Everything's got mouthful clarinets. There's a movie called DOA. And DOA is a look at the Sex Pistols, it's a look at Sid and Nancy, and it's a look at the punk scene at the time in England. Give it a look. It is brilliant. I also like how Great Rock and Roll Swindle was a thing. And for those of you who need your Gary Oldman fix, Sid and Nancy. And then punk died. This will become a recurring theme. Punk, some people will stake their claim that punk was over in 1979 when the Pistols imploded. They, for a band with its legacy, it only put out one record. Sid Vicious dies after likely killing his girlfriend. The Clash signed to a major label. People say in 1977 that was the moment punk died, despite the fact they, again, are conveniently forgetting that the Pistols were on freaking EMI. The Ramones start getting experimental, and they start pushing the genre. There was too much the well starts to run dry. There's too much violence, and ultimately, too many of its practitioners lack the wit with which to execute a second act. Think of how many punk bands had one album, and were gone. And that's it. Think of how many of them went to that well, they recorded their masterpiece like the Pistols, and then you never heard from them again. Think about how many of them had the wit with which to execute a second act, and you end up with something like Sandinista, which is one of those Clash records where people thought the band was called Sandinista, and the album was called The Clash, because that couldn't possibly be The Clash. It doesn't sound like that. But this, of course, leads to the genre explosion in the 80s. This is where, and I'm sorry, I don't think there's anything in music that can't be explained without using a Fall Out Boy lyric. And I happen to like this idea of Sophomore Slumper Album of the Year. This is an era where you start seeing evolution. Crust is replaced with creativity. You start to see new ideas and practitioners add their own flair. The scene starts to evolve, and you start seeing things like this. So punk purists like to say that this time's over by the 80s, and you can't have this without the uniform and all of that. But at the same time, every bit of our culture evolves. I'm an anthropologist. Culture evolves. Everything evolves. You start seeing people like Patti Smith, who is punk despite the fact that she did not play punk music. Billy Bragg pretty much influenced Lars Fredriksson to become a bastard and help with Rancid. You see the attitudes start to supersede the music, and you see things start to evolve. And you have a genre explosion. If you do not evolve your genre, you die. And the best way of thinking about this is with my choice for this video. It is a Ramones video. Like, what kind of genres are popping up out of this? Well, there's a lot of them. You got post-punk, evolving the sound with a mature musical theme. A lot of bands, you start seeing post-punk pop up in the late 70s. Bands that did not want to play punk but liked the ethos, like the musical genre explosion. You have mod, whatever the hell that means. But they harken their days back to the, I guess bowler hats, I don't know. Put a tie on it, you get new wave. Get disaffected with disaffection and you go goth. Faster, louder, angrier, you have hardcore. And I got one more on this little wheel of subgenres. One that I have actually, again, gotten punched over. Thrash metal. And people look at me and they're like, what? Who were the foundational bands of thrash metal? Anthrax, Iron Maiden, Metallica. Metallica's Kill 'Em All, when it was released, metal clubs wouldn't take them because they were too fast. Punk clubs wouldn't take them because they were too heavy. Iron Maiden's first record, the one before Number of the Beast, was considered to be a punk crossover album. Anthrax borrowed its cues from punk rock, and they would continue to work with punk bands later. Thrash metal is itself an offshoot, maybe a subgenre of a subgenre, but a lot of early thrash artists borrowed punk's speed, its snottiness, and its intensity when building the genre. Because at this point, your metal was either hair, whatever the hell Ozzy was doing, or thrash. And you see this with other bands. Punk rock also goes international.
例の伝説のリンダリンダドド。
This is the Blue Hearts, best described as the Ramones of Japan.
みたいに美しくなりたい写真
He cannot sing.
には
Like, at all.
テレビに
This dude
も
cannot
映
sing.
らない
And he doesn't care. Add to this, you also have the 80s and late 80s Shonen Night, the girl version of this.
春からリンダリンダリンダリンダリンダ
1985 to 1995. The Blue Hearts had some Japanese and American scenes.
僕がいつか君と出会い
And this is them playing live on a TV show in Japan.
そんな時
I
は
love Japanese
ど
punk.
うか
You'll see that again in the battle. I enjoy Japanese punk.
知ってく
But this is where
ださ
it
い
starts. This is where you start with it.
リンダリンダリンダリンダ
I say while I'm drinking a strong zero, fresh from Japan.
リンダリンダリンダ
So, let's just look at some names from this period. You got Joy Division. Joy Division, big into new wave, a lot of hits, blended together that disaffection, had some fun with it. Same with Sisters of Mercy. You have Elvis Costello doing blends of mod and rock, taking it to new levels. You have Bauhaus being all goth. You have the Smiths stinking up the joint. I don't like the Smiths. I'll fight you. No, my money is on the Cure in that fight. You got the Cramps, you've got the Pixies, you've got the Minutemen, and you've got the Replacements. At this point, you're seeing bands that were inspired by punk rock going out and building their own thing. And I simply want to bring out one song by the Minutemen. It's called Corona. All of you have heard it, I think, because of this. That is the song playing in the background of the Jackass opening. It's Corona by the Minutemen. Their album, Double Nickels on the Dime, is one of the best double albums of the left of the dial movement in the 80s. Again, gone way too soon. But again, what's more punk than Jackass? So again, you're going to see, like, the playlist for this year is insane. You got Billy Idol, who is from Generation X. They were a London punk band, going out and blending it together with dancehall music. You've got the Ramones going experimental. Wire, one of the unsung heroes of 70s and 80s punk. This was back when everyone went to art school, and when you were in art school, you formed a punk band. Wire did Pink Flag and came out of that era. You start seeing the Pixies pop up. You start seeing a lot of these wonderful bands. And I chose here one that's kind of important for me, Replacements. The song Bastards of Young is actually off their major label debut, Tim, which was when most people started really hating the Replacements because they sold out. That said, Bastards of Young is one of the best examples of this post-punk, left-of-the-dial movement that you found in that era. You also have a lot of really, really great movies coming out. Another state of mind is the Social Distortion movie, where a filmmaker goes on the road with Social D, who started in this era, and records what she saw. Meanwhile, End of the Century was when I started really liking the Ramones. I saw that when it came out in 2004 at the Angelica Film Center, and that is what touched off my love for the Ramones. I was always more of a Clash person, and then I saw End of the Century, and I ended up falling head over heels for the Ramones. At that point, that's when I bought my first Ramones t-shirt, which has now been completely effing destroyed by many years of the Warped Tour. But again, AJ had some recs for movies. And if you haven't seen Return of the Living Dead, it's absolutely brilliant. He has a bunch of punks. It's punks versus zombies. And it doesn't end well. So you'll notice something was missing from that. I showed a lot of different genres, but I didn't go into one major one. One major one that was very big in this neck of the woods. Tell me what we say out of your dollar. This is Bad Brains. I love you. So I put on here, I chose them because guys notice they're African American. They are one of the stalwart founders of hardcore. From DC, African American band. Also, they charge some if you want to see him be insane, check out the Outhouse documentary. That man is insane. But this is the start of the hardcore movement. Hardcore is the one that's still essentially going. New wave went away, mod went away, goth became really fun. Thrash became really fun. When it comes to punk rock, the legacy was often carried by bands who were hardcore and loved the hardcore genre. So hardcore itself is a reaction to punk going crazy. As punk was experimenting, there were people who didn't like this. There were people who said it should be loud, fast, and snotty, and hard, and strong, and powerful, and let's be anti-establishment. Let's have all of this kind of internal rage manifesting up, and that's where you got your hardcore. That's your bands like Minor Threat. That's your bands like The Bad Brains. That's your bands like in New York we had Agnostic Front. These were bands that were taking the purest ethos of the music and running with it. It's a combination essentially of DIY, straight edge, and violence. Because hardcore is insane. Hardcore shows, when I was going to hardcore shows, like between 98 and 2006, I didn't lose any teeth, but I know I knocked people's teeth out. It was a lot of kicking. If you've ever heard the term picking up change, that gets pretty scary. But the idea behind it was very violent. You were working through your aggression through the music. At the same time, it was still DIY. And one of the biggest movements in there is straight edge. I was straight edge from 18 to 23, and then I discovered I liked beer. But you ever see the guys with the X's on their hands? They don't drink, they don't smoke, they don't do drugs, they don't have promiscuous sex. And it was all about keeping yourself in that little group. This was, again, DC, Southern California, New York. And DC had a great, great scene. But the best way of talking about it, I'm friends with this guy, Zach Davison. He's a translator for Drawn and Quarterly. And he was, we were having a room party at Anime Next last year. And I was talking about punk rock, and he says to me, you can't have punk rock without Ronald Reagan. And I stopped for a second and I'm like, Zach, punk's from the 70s. Aren't you thinking of hardcore? And he stops for a second and he's like, okay, I'll give you that. It's hardcore. Because this was a movement, especially in the DC scene, that was built out of giving, to everything. And I find this really funny, especially in our modern day political climate. What was it yesterday? One of the commentators on Fox News said that the youth of America is going to flock to Donald Trump because he's punk rock. Really? Really? He's punk rock. No, he is a fat old man. I want to renew my scene card just so I can make songs that talk trash about this guy. Because this was all about the disaffection manifesting in different ways. The DC scene was huge into this because the DC scene was in the shadow of Reaganomics. Southern California was built out of it, and the New York scene was very much built out of blending it together with crossover music. And I just want to throw this one out on here. This is Suicidal Tendencies.
Sometimes I try to do things,
this one, right?
it just doesn't work out the way I want it to.
Help
I get
all I
real
really wanted was a
frustrated.
Pepsi.
They're like, I try hard to do it, and I take my time, but
I
it
think
just doesn't work out the way I want it to. It's like I concentrate on real hard, but it just doesn't work out. Everything I do and everything I try, it never turns out. It's like I need time to figure these things out. There's always someone there going, hey Mike, we've been noticing you've been having a lot of problems lately, maybe get away, and like, maybe you should talk about it, you'll feel a lot better. I go, no, it's okay, I'll figure it out. Just leave me alone, I'll figure it out, I'm just working on myself. They go, well, if you want to talk about it, I'll be here, and you'll probably feel a lot better if you talk about it. So why don't you talk about it? I go, no, I don't want to, I'm okay. I'll figure it out myself. They just keep bugging me.
So much fun.
Bugging me, and it feels on the side.
I don't know if you guys have ever heard the Dead Milkmen. The Dead Milkmen were this with less power chords. But they have that song, Vincent Camaro, which is like 2 minutes of them talking about a car, and 90 seconds of the song. So let's just look at some names, because there's a lot of great names for here. Minor Threat, they get the most credit for this. For years, my Twitter picture profile was me doing a Minor Threat pose. Minor Threat gets its start with straight edge and a bunch of things. You got the Circle Jerks. I'm going to play a song for them in a second. You got Black Flag coming out of Southern California. Henry Rollins is from this neck of the woods. He moves to Southern California. He gets up on stage, screams a few songs for Black Flag. They invite him to join the band. He joins the band. You got a New York agnostic front. Now, this is the one I wanted to bring up for you guys. Rites of Spring. Rites of Spring was a DC hardcore band from like 85 to 86. They put out one album and then broke up. They are the first emo band. That much maligned genre from like, fuck the establishment, sir. But that much maligned genre from the early aughts of boy bands and breakdowns and all that crap got started with Rites of Spring. I highly recommend you track down their music and give it a listen. After the band broke up, their lead singer would eventually form Fugazi with Ian MacKaye, as Ian MacKaye came out of Minor Threat. And they would continue to make music together. You have the Dead Kennedys out in California. You've got Bad Brains, again, just across the river. You've got the Misfits. And I wanted to put a Misfits song on here. My favorite Misfits song is Last Caress. So for those of you that know it, know why I'm not putting it on here. But for the rest of you, that song was the favorite Misfits song of one Cliff Burton, bass player for Metallica. He loved, rest in peace, Cliff. You got it. Now, this is the first time I'm putting in a label. Discord and SST were the first labels to put out hardcore. Discord was Ian MacKaye, and SST was Greg Ginn from Black Flag. When labels wouldn't touch the stuff, because at this point, punk is over. No one will make money off of this. Labels won't put it out. They created their own labels. That's what I mean by DIY. They created it. And these are the first labels to cater specifically to the scene. This is something that would continue well into the 90s. And I got one more band I gotta mention. The Beastie Boys. So some people are like, weren't they a rap group? No. They were a hardcore band. 1982. On public access. 17 years old. This is a song about a club that wouldn't let them in, so they drove back later in the night and chucked eggs at it.
Our mothers.
And it goes out to their mothers. The sound is terrible, but this was the Beasties before they became the rappers. Also, rest in peace, Adam Young. Man, all the good ones are dead. Now, if you really want to see a good Beastie Boys song, and you want to have fun listening to their old stuff, listen to this song, Cookie Puss. They called up a car bell asking to speak to Cookie Puss. It's amazing, and this is where the playlist just goes insane. At this point, my playlist is just getting too big. We got Operation Ivy on here out of the Gilman Club out 94 Gilman out in California. That was pre-Rancid. You've got all of these bands that were pushing what you could do with the genre, and they've made tons of great movies about this. My favorite of these is Outhouse. It's a little long, but it's an amazing film. But you see how it changed music, and then for 1 minute of your life, I give you some hardcore. This is two songs.
Everything just as what you will. For the person, piece of game. In a jam. God, really guilty. Everything.
31 seconds. Go.
1, 2, 3.
But I love how the second song is called I Don't Care.
Don't care. Play a homie. Don't care. As a man. Don't care. Respect. Don't care. So ready.
That's
don't care. Don't care. Don't care. I don't care.
As I said, this is a recurring theme because hardcore would gladly put it out of its misery. But here's the thing. Metal was where the money was. No one started punk bands to make money. Everyone wanted to essentially be Skid Row not like Social Distortion. Meanwhile, rap started taking over the counterculture. And you see this again with Anthrax, working with Ice-T to create Body Count, Cop Killer in the early 90s. Rap was becoming the ethos and the beats. You started to see Public Enemy, the NWA, and Nirvana taking this over. Because by the time you hit the 90s, things got interesting. Now, the term, the democratization of punk, was coined by Greg Graffin, the lead singer of Bad Religion, who formed his band in 1980 and put out a few records that sold okay. In fact, Brett Gurewitz, his guitar player, decided, you know what, no one's signing our stuff, so I'm going to create a label, and I'm going to put my stuff out. And he sells like 10,000 copies of one of their albums. And you can't believe how they're good fortune. They go to Germany and they sell another 10,000 copies in Germany. And you see this happen, but it's still very underground. And then that happens. By 1994, you start seeing punk bands gaining attention from major labels. In 1993, Bad Religion puts out its album Recipe for Hate, which contains my favorite Bad Religion song of all time, American Jesus. They get major label attention. They get signed. But earlier than that, early 90s, Social Distortion gets signed by a major label. The first band in the 80s punk revolution to actually get signed to a major. And as this happens, people are starting to see there's something to be had here. But you see things start to change. Some of the bands from this generation are not from the crust era. They're bored teenage kids. Particular bored teenage kid used to go to shows every single week at 924 Gilman, which itself was a music commune event space in the Bay Area. And he used to play music. He used to go to see shows. He would beg bands like Operation Ivy to let him come to the show and see their thing. And he would write songs. He formed a little band with his friends in 1988 called Sweet Children, and they would play a bunch of shows at Gilman. And these guys were a bunch of they would call themselves middle-class kids who were singing about disaffection and singing about how everything kind of sucks and I'm using this as a way to channel my rage. And then they were told that their band name is terrible. So in the late 80s, they changed their name from Sweet Children to Green Day. And they put out their first 3 albums on Lookout Records, which was started by Lawrence Livermore of the Lookouts, who was himself very into the scene. There's still disaffection, but things are starting to change. Most namely, you're going to start seeing them making money. This is when punk bands started to make money. And even the punk bands you don't consider to be punk bands were growing out of the punk scene. Green Day did not play punk. They played very fast pop music, unless you're listening to Insomniac. They played very fast pop music. But they grew out of the scene, and you started to see this explosion. Now it all starts with this. And I love how I first heard this song on guitar. In 1990, they get signed to a major. They sell 150,000 copies of their self-titled. It's their 4th release overall. Next thing you know, they're back. And the first time I heard Social Distortion was in the lyrics of a Good Charlotte song. These guys blended together punk rock and country, which you might think sounds a little ridiculous. I beg you to look up the Swingin' Utters. Look up Swingin' Utters, and you will hear some shit. My guess was 1984 when Social Distortion had a radio hit and a video in the 80s. And this is where it starts getting running out of time. I didn't want to do this. I really, really did not want to dilute the entire era down to 3 bands, but I had to. And it's pretty much broken down into this. The first of those bands is, but they could easily be replaced with a band like Rancid or NoFX. This is your scene band that sells a bunch of records, makes a stable career out of what they're doing, creates their own record label, contributes back to the scene. Doesn't go super famous. This is a great record, by the way. This is my first Bad Religion record. I love it. Still love it. But they never went super huge, but they built a career and supported the scene. Brett Gurewitz's label, Epitaph, signed every punk band coming out of California at the time as a way of showing there was vitality in the scene. That was DIY, giving back to your people. But I said, you replace this with Rancid, whose album Let's Go in 1994 is still my favorite Rancid record of all time. or you could replace it with NoFX, whom I actually personally hate. Then you have the band that made it big. That's your Green Day. That's your Weezer. That's your Offspring. The band that grows out of the scene, sells tens of millions of records. This was 22 million worldwide. The Offspring smash 19 million. To this day, it is the highest selling independent record ever released. Not on a major. 19 million records on Epitaph. And these are the bands that got famous. I said, you got to keep them separated. You know exactly what that song is. That is Come Out and Play by the Offspring that I almost put in this panel. Then the third band here is the band that could have, but didn't. That's Jawbreaker. Jawbreaker had a wonderful career. They put out some of that. Their documentary, by the way, phenomenal. Saw it last year. And as I said, Blake Schwarzenbach was my English teacher, one of my English professors in college, and my girlfriend used to stalk him. So Jawbreaker could have been, but they didn't. They sold a lot of records, but by the time they could have been big, they failed. You could replace this with any other band that soared high, but didn't quite make it. And that's where punk was going in the early 90s. You either had your stable scene band, your superstar, or your they could have been, and all we have is the songs. This, of course, leads to my favorite thing, the great debate. Because you can't talk about this without talking about Nirvana. Was Nirvana a punk band? Nirvana started the entire thing that destroyed hair metal and allowed alternative music to be a thing. Thanks to Nirvana, we had fame for bands like Pearl Jam and Soundgarden. Could you lump Nirvana into the punk scene? Well, you could lump this out into the punk scene. Seattle's punk scene was thriving, but they went off in different directions. To give you the idea, they would open the door. In fact, they even credit, Social D credits getting signed to Nirvana's popularity because they kind of sounded like Nirvana. I didn't hear it. But you see them start to show that there's alternatives to the music that you can grab.
Bob.
This was going to be Come Out and Play.
Bobby.
Yeah, I changed it.
Out of here.
Spent 15 years getting loaded. 15.
This is NoFX. I hate NoFX. I put on Punk and Drublic the other day just to remind myself that I hate it.
What you been thinking about?
But
That's the point. I won't think about nothing.
one of my friends in college was super into NoFX and Dungeons and Dragons, and I used to go to his house. We met through NoFX, we hung out playing D&D, and then one day I went to his apartment, knocked on the door opened, there's a girl standing there. I looked at her and I'm like, oh, girl in his apartment. They're probably effing. No, they weren't. That girl is now my fiance. So I owe NoFX to me having a girlfriend. So there's a lot of good things that came in here. You got the Offspring, who I often said do not get enough credit. They were a punk band from the 80s that got big, but since they were on the outskirts of the punk scene, people thought they were prefabricated. Bad Religion did more for this era than almost anything else. You could say they started the skate punk revolution. Green Day got super famous. NoFX would eventually go on to have a great career and release a lot of the records that I was listening to in the 90s. NoFX gave Strung Out a platform, and Strung Out is my favorite late 90s punk band. Rancid was doing pretty well, but then you have bands like Social Distortion, which was the first one to sign to a major. Jawbreaker did, but failed. Weezer is still Weezer. Now, I have this as, yeah, I know. Did you see the SNL sketch? Look up Saturday Night Live Weezer. You're going to love it. It's so good. And the Vandals, I have them in quotes because they're literally a stand-in for any other band from this era. No Use for a Name, Frenzel Rom, Stick of It All, Swingin' Utters, Vizo, Tilt, Dancehall Crashers, Fabulous Disasters, The Lawrence Arms. They're a stand-in for any band that had a career on this circuit but didn't go super famous. And again, I bring up Epitaph because that was the DIY label that did it. And then, of course, you have things like this. Great video. I'm sure you all know Basket Case, right? Good, because I want to jump. Take a photo of this. It'll last longer. My personal favorite one. Oh, there's my Descendants song. I have Bikeage on there. Excellent fucking song. My personal one in here is Lifetime. Lifetime was a hardcore band that grew out of this era that would eventually, again, lead to post-hardcore later down the line. And I knew I wasn't going to be able to finish the entire panel all the way in because we're only up to here. This is part 2. when people realize you can make money off it, you have a second genre explosion. But the thing about this is when you had MTV. MTV was a thing before. This is where MTV makes it big. This is where disaffected suburbanites run around. And again, there's a Fall Out Boy sound lyric using the music to make sense of their own life. And my favorite way of just looking at this, I'm just going to throw it up here because I only have a couple minutes. This is magnified plaid, aka MXPX. This is when they stopped being a Christian punk band and tried to be a hardcore punk band. And this is actually a criticism of punk rock's dilution in the mid-90s. All I know is back in the 90s, MXPX agreed to do an interview with my school newspaper. And one of my friends, we're sitting in the radio station, and one of my friends asks MXPX in 2002, how does it feel to be on tour opening up for bands that cite you as their major influence? The band just stopped. Yuri, the drummer, smacked my friend on the back of the head, and they said, hey, we still made enough money to live on. And they went back to the interview. But there's a lot of names from here that you're going to recognize. Possibly the first band to ever use TRL and MTV to their advantage. Blink-182 is my second favorite band of all time behind the Goo Goo Dolls. And if you don't know about the Goo Goo Dolls and Buffalo hardcore in the late 80s, look up the song Up Yours. Saves the day, comes out of New Jersey. A Newfound Glory pops up in Florida. And again, there's MXPX, there's the Get Up Kids. You've got Fat Wreck and Drive Thru putting out the music you love, which led to bands like Strung Out, which is, again, my favorite band from late 90s punk, and the Vans Warped Tour. Nothing represents the cultural zeitgeist of the late 90s quite like going to the Warped Tour, paying $10 for a basket of chicken wings, getting sunburned on your head, getting punched in the face to an Atari song, going home and saying, I want to go back. Oh, no, not punched in the face. Sorry, I got kicked in the balls. And of course, I bring up the Ataris because, again, they were my favorite band from that era. And you start to see it, and again, there's a reason why Blink-182 closes every show with this song. I have seen Blink 5 times. All those times, they close with this. Look at those clean-cut boys with their frosted tips singing about breakups and heartache. This song pushed this album platinum. Their next record was Enema of the State. I discovered them. So I hit 9:30, and I'm just gonna throw out this. This is a great little thing. I'll take some photos of the playlist for this. But you know what? F the playlist. All you gotta do, I'm seeing you taking a photo, so I'm waiting until you're done. It was hard for me to curate this one. F the playlist, just buy that. Short music for short people. 101 bands playing 30-second songs. It was such a great record. There's a song in here called I Like Food, Food is Good. And of course, that. And then just to show you where things are going, I had to play this. Yes, my favorite Japanese punk. No, second favorite Japanese punk. This is from their new record that came out in 2017. Yes, 15 years after their last record that was out.
Are you ready tonight? We count down the show. Can you hold the time? Here we go again. The time is right. Hey, are you satisfied?
Seriously, any convention that invites these guys to play, I will do their con for free. Just because I want to see them live. I would kill to see these guys live. Yeah, look up the album The Chips. That's the one that came out last year. So, of course, punk's dead. It doesn't matter anymore. The industry's broken anyway. You're doing whatever you want. The internet allows you to spread it. And this is actually a quote from Green Day. Does anyone care if nobody cares? Honestly, it's all about freedom and F Bob Dylan. Every band does sound the same, but you know what? Bob Dylan, you can't sing. So, he can't. Bob Dylan cannot sing. He just goes, da, da, da. At least Tom Waits knew what melody was. But all I gotta say, the best way of describing this entire generation,
Nevertheless, I'm a dress for the occasion.
Canada's own.
With the people who feed, they don't change the station.
I love these guys. I love these guys so much.
Stand up at the money because it tells the resorts about sweating over. It's in the blank guy shorts.
And of course, you know this song. You couldn't go anywhere in 2001 without hearing this. I have seen Sum 41 live multiple times because of this song. So, as you can see, I'm now in my punk rage. But you all know Fat Lip. If you don't know Fat Lip, you probably weren't born in time for it. And again, you have your subgenre explosion with bands like power pop, post-hardcore, emo, which goes back to the 80s, whatever you want, core. Insert your genre here, it doesn't matter. Japanese punk band. This is actually my favorite Japanese punk band, Elgarden, otherwise known as the Japanese Blink-182. Anyone who knows me or has seen me talk about anything involving Japanese punk for the last, 5 years, I will not shut up about this band. I have a homemade Elgarden t-shirt. I got dragged up on stage at a Rookies is Punk show because I was wearing it, because apparently they were Rookie Senpai. So Senpai noticed this. But yeah, I saw these guys at South by Southwest in 2006, and I fell head over heels to them. They're insane.
I'm growing up to be a better man, but I always fell into a dirty bug. I wanna grab the flag, but there's
I was
always
able to get the song
someone
8 Beats a
faster.
Man, but just run with it.
I'm trying to leave, but it's seriously, but what's on my mind? Cause you know always girls, but I mean that's me, pass me that potato.
And yes, they
chips.
say English, I know that it is.
You know
Because
what?
in punk, you can't have nice things. So, some names. Yeah. Yeah. East Bay Hardcore, man. Never have I seen a band evolve like AFI. You know what? I don't mind Good Charlotte, and their album from 2 years ago, Youth Authority, is one of the best punk, not punk, but the best rock records I've ever heard in my life. I really like Jimmy Eat World, and I got my copy of Bleed American 2 days before 9/11 when it was still called Bleed American. I was at that Taking Back Sunday show from Nothing Feels Good. I loved Coheed and Cambria. Those guys are amazing. I also love Rise Against. I love Fall Out Boy, but it's literally anyone. And before anyone out there talks about mall punk and Fall Out Boy isn't punk, I present to you. They were a pop punk band. Keith Wentz was in a hardcore band with typical rap from Rise Against in the 90s called R.A.
This is the last time.
You know what? They get back to
I never say no to you. This conversation.
This is my D&D character's favorite punk band.
And there's no way to talk to you.
And yes, my D&D character has a favorite punk band.
Dead on the rivalry. You're so deep.
I saw these guys in 2005 in the video with Motion City soundtrack. And that night was awkward, horribly awkward, because 20 minutes into the show, I bumped into a bunch of my students from my high school social studies class. A bunch of 14-year-olds. Oh, hey, Mr. Dunbar. Are you following us? I like Fall Out Boy. Aren't you like 24? Okay, I'm leaving. So again, I got a playlist for this. This playlist was super freaking hard, and I put on Paramore because my friend Kira is super into Paramore, but she's in Japan right now, and Kira Fox usually comes to this con. She's not here this year. She misses it. So Paramore, because she likes Paramore, and she cosplays Hayley Williams. But the thing about this playlist is it gets bigger. Many thanks to this dude over here for Teenage Bottle Rocket playing the Ramones better than the Ramones since the mid-90s. I do like Movie Life. I do enjoy it. And I love that Lars and the Bastards have a great cover of Billy Bragg's To Have and Have Not. And, or you can just buy the soundtrack to these games. So again, my recs for this year, I love the new Turnstile record. It's a great introduction to hardcore from a hardcore band that likes Blink-182. The Armed is freaking insane. State Champs' new album, Living Proof, is a great introduction to State Champs. And simply because I am still standing here and I made it to the end, I'm going to present to you my guilty pleasure band and my favorite song by my guilty pleasure band. A Day to Remember. Doing Newfound Glory better than Newfound Glory. Las Vegas Strip in 2014, trying to get back to Planet Hollywood to do a panel Rodicon Vegas listening to this in my earbuds. My D&D character's favorite song by the day, remember? Look at this video. The hardest band in pop punk, but grew up in the metalcore scene of Florida in the middle of the aughts. And this is what I mean by there are no rules anymore.
Started out in the spring of 2003.
No rules anymore.
Never went to school.
Just be yourself, enjoy it, and run.
So I hear about it. Got with my guys, back to all our cards and all the lyrics. Sings in every local bar. Played a show at night till it made me sick. So here I am. I'm right back at it again. Just like I've always said. You get your
Watch this quality on this video. It took me like 2 weeks to do this.
I'm right back at it again. Just like I've always said. Get your corpus going. Here to make no friends. Let's hold with you'll get a backup plan. And everyone we knew that we couldn't stand. And if you can't make it or you won't make it there. Don't wanna hear about it. We must have hard times, sleeping on hardwood floors. People say be rude and idiot. We told we play show at night till it all made sense. So here I am. I'm right back at it again.
I love
Just
this.
like
It has
I've
this
always said. Get your corpus
It's gonna be a wild notice now.
I'm right back at it again. Just like I've always said. Get your corpus going.
Listen to this. Listen to this. This is a pop song. This is a pop song played on 2 guitars. I don't care.
Don't wanna hear about it. Don't wanna hear about it again. So here I am. I'm right back at it again.
Watch this next.
Just like I've always said. Get your corpus going. Here to make no friends, and I'll say, I'm right back at it again. Just like I've always said. Get your corpus going. Here to make no friends or impact. Don't wanna hear about it. Don't wanna hear about it.
And that's where punk is now. There's no more rules. Who gives a damn? Let's just have some fun, playing some loud music and enjoying each other. The last time I saw a day to remember, I punched a kid in the face and I think I knocked his teeth out. So that's all I got to say. And I thank you for being here for the entire panel.